Where the $70,000 came from.
She's the perfect person to come to America to create nuclear bombs.
She was involved in advocacy for Bosnia, right?
She was going to be smuggled into the US by Al-Qaeda in league with the Colombian drug cartel.
I'd love for you to talk about that.
So because they're in the CIA, they leap to the conclusion that he's an Al-Qaeda financier.
Let's go back to Aafia's story, right?
When his children were later abducted in 2003, did absolutely nothing to try and get him back.
Majid Khan and Aafia went down to the store, bought a bunch of stuff.
Both he and Aafia end up on
FBI's most wanted.
She wanted to go to Bosnia.
Based on what you've said, you seem to be skeptical of Amjad Khan's intentions.
I made it up, obviously, but I can tell you as an absolute fact that's false.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. It's quite a special episode of the Pakistan Experience. This person is living my life. I could have been a lawyer working for human rights.
But you wouldn't have been this bad, surely. You would have been better than that.
I would have been reprehensible. I would have had contempt of court against me every single day. Clive Stafford Smith is here with us. He's an OBE, has the Gandhi Peace Award. A lot of people who've been unjustly kept in prisons for years. Clive has come into their lives as a guardian angel, as
Can
the last ray of hope.
When we get past all the nonsense about that, I just want you to tell the good people of Pakistan what OBE stands for, right?
The crown is not in there.
No.
The office of the British order.
Order of the British.
That was close.
And what's the E? It's
England?
Awful. No, it's worse. I just want your listeners to have a good laugh at me. It's the Order of the British Empire, which doesn't exist anymore except for the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar. And I just want you to know I did it for my mum. She got to meet the Queen, but it's a huge embarrassment. I just want to make that clear.
So Clive is here as the Empire Strikes Back. The Brits are back. But for once, they're invited, and we're happy that he's here with us. First of all, how are you doing, Clive?
Well, I'm doing very well. I just spent a few days in Afghanistan, which is always actually such a pleasure. There are very few governments in the world where I represented most of them when they were in Guantanamo Bay. And, you know, let's face it, whatever criticisms you may have of Afghanistan, and I'm sure there are a few, but these people understand injustice, and that's
Do you get any special treatment? Like if somebody who just has suffered at the hands of people who look like you, and when they go after you, are the other people like, no, he's one of the good ones. No, not him.
I get treated far too well. I want you to abuse me just to get back to the real world. But they're in.
What's your football team?
Ipswich Town, the Tractor Boys. Not one of those big ones. You got to have a pathetic team. So, what's yours? Do you have one?
It's one of the pathetic ones. It's Manchester United.
No, that's despicable.
Yeah, I agree.
You are just going along with the big league. I like to be them. You know, the Ipswich are called the Tractor Boys, which means they're a bunch of farmers, and they haven't won anything since 1969, and that's cool.
I mean, it's the story, right? It's the story of Munich that just makes that association with Manchester United. Well, the reason you're here is you're currently representing Aafia Siddiqui. We're going to try and tell the entire story. I know you've said it a fair few times. I've had a few questions while listening to all your other podcasts, which I will ask you. But let's, before we go back in time, last month, Shehbaz Sharif and the current government has requested clemency. And then there was a news in Dawn a couple of days ago which said that a judge, I believe it's Burnham, who said that they're going to open up the case because you've presented some new evidence.
Both of those things are wrong.
Dawn News, you've let me down.
Dawn News has let you down. First, Judge Berman hasn't entered that order. I don't know where they got that from. I've asked him to, and I was in New York, and I told him I really need the order by such and such a date, because I've flown all this way to do it, and he just didn't do it. And he will eventually, but he hasn't done it yet. And in terms of the government here, they haven't intervened yet in the clemency. They need to. And I flew through Islamabad today and stayed last night, actually, in the hope that I could get a meeting with them. But they're actually too busy messing up your entire constitution.
I mean, if they ever need a lawyer, now is the time. So let's go back in time. First, let's set the stage. 9/11 happens, terrible tragedy. But just a week after 9/11, George Bush passes a law which changes the shape of human rights forever. So let's...
Not forever. We're going to get them back. But what they call the authorization for the use of military force. And look, I got to say, I'm American, right? But I underestimated how deranged our country was going to be. And it's largely, well, I grew up in England and, in Europe, we're kind of used to being invaded every few years for the last 1,000 years. But America... You were
in Britain. You're the one doing the invading more often than not.
Well, that's true. We have a great record for that. And I should tell you, my name's Clive, right? You know where that comes from.
But not Robert, though.
But Robert Clive is where I get my name from. And that
Were you actually named after Robert Clive?
No, but everyone called Clive is named after Robert Clive. And for those of you who don't know, he pillaged across India. He was the first British person indicted for corruption in office. And he got off
by bribing the jury.
Yeah, in the traditional fashion. So, I've got a lot to make up for, let's face it. So, sorry, going back to the AUMF. So after 9/11, we lost our collective sanity. And it's largely because America's only actually had 3 invasions in its history. And you can tell them by the exact dates. 9/11, 2001. No, 9/11. That's 12/7 or 7/12 is Pearl Harbor, 1941. And then 1812. My God, you're... And in 1812...
I was in America for a couple of years.
Yeah, and as you know, in 1812, the British burnt the White House. It used to be the Grey House until we burnt it down and they made it white. So that's it. And the Americans... I was very surprised because I'd spent the previous 20-some years representing people on death row because that's the classic... We hate you because you're a young black person and we're going to blame you for everything bad in America. And so that's why I represented people there. And they turn around and they decide, actually, no, it's not young African-American men, it's you, bearded Muslims. I see myself, he's all right, but you two are very dubious. And it really was shocking, actually, the translation of hatred onto Muslim men. And I thought... this is madness. Let's sue George Bush. What could be more fun? And honestly, I couldn't find anyone else to do it. In all my liberal American little world, people just wouldn't do it because they were so shocked. And so in the end, I did it with a couple of friends. I finally talked into it on February the 19th, 2002, this Guantanamo stuff. And I don't have a television, right? I never watch TV. And so they said someone needs to go on TV and defend us on this. So I went on TV. I think it was Fox. And in a 5-minute interview, I got accused of being a traitor 13 times. And
it's Fox.
Yeah. But I got death threats from all sorts of people that night. And it was astounding to me that people couldn't see how mad this whole process was. But there we go. That was Guantanamo for you.
So we all know the American history. We all know that. And if people didn't, if that was a surprise to somebody, what's happening in Israel and the American support for the genocide, it should be clear to everybody what America's foreign policy for years has been and how much they've pretended to champion human rights and what they've actually done, whether it's to the Native Americans or the black community.
There have been times when America's been better, but the last 20 years have just been a disaster.
I mean, there were internment camps after Pearl Harbor. So
yeah, there were.
Better is relative.
No, that was awful. But, actually, when I started out in, 70s, late 70s, early 80s, we were doing a bit better.
I mean, that's right off the back of Jim Crow. So
no, Jim Crow was way before that.
But the civil rights movement.
Oh, yeah. No, look, we had a long way to come up. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when you look at the U.S. Constitution, I'm a great fan of the U.S. Constitution, but originally it had slavery in it. So, no, I agree with you. That's you're right about that.
So if we come specifically to Aafia's case, before anything even happens, I think there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of information. So I want to run it all by you since I'm sure you've looked at it. So even before anything happens, even before 9/11, she was involved in advocacy for Bosnia, right? And she got into trouble because of this Mercy International group, which was involved in the 98 bombings.
She actually didn't get into trouble at all back then. But one of the really interesting things when you're unpicking why the government mix. I should say, when I went to Guantanamo, I thought, they say these are the worst and the worst terrorists in the world, and they were in Afghanistan fighting. And I say, they're going to mess up, but I bet I'm going to have some explaining to do, And for me, it was more a matter of principle. But when I got down there, it was actually very hard to find an honest-to-goodness terrorist.
I think the numbers you've presented is out of 780 people, 9 died, and there are 13 and 14 who were still on trial, and everybody else was exonerated from the top 6 intelligence agencies. And I think you've said that's a failure rate of 99.5%.
Yeah. And the thing about that, I was flying across on British Airways one time, and I was talking to the stewardess about this. I was going to Guantanamo. And I said, would you fly on an airline that went to the wrong airport 99.5, or maybe crashed 90?
No, I would not fly on a Boeing, because they seem to be doing those numbers.
They are doing that. So, it was just crazy there. But one of the things that's been very, very interesting and difficult has been to unpick why they screw up so badly. Because, I want you to go through everything that you think you know, or the world thinks they know about Aafia. But I've had the privilege in the last few months of talking to an American Secret Service person who told me what they thought. And it's just madness. He says that,
the nuclear bomb theory, right? Because of MIT.
It was the nuclear bomb theory. So they thought first that this is a very well-educated scientist who had a PhD in physics from MIT. She didn't have a PhD from MIT.
She has an education from Brandeis.
From Brandeis. And so they had that, and they thought, well, this makes her the perfect person, because she's Pakistani and she wears a headscarf, that she's the perfect person to come to America to create nuclear bombs. And I've had a number of clients who have been thought to be nuclear bombers.
Binyam Mohammad is the one.
Binyam Mohammad is, fabulous.
He's written a book, right?
No, he hasn't actually. I wish he would. I wrote, there's a whole chapter of my book about it. But so then the thing that you've just got to say, where did these people get this from? What drugs were they on? Is the US security people thought that she was going to be smuggled into the US by Al-Qaeda in league with the Colombian drug cartels. Now, where do they get this from?
Narcos.
I have a fabulous case I've worked on for 31 years where I went.
That's the book you've written.
That's another book I've written called Injustice. But where I went down to Colombia and met all narcos, because I represented half of them, frankly. And, I just don't know where the American intelligence got this idea from. So that was the theory they had, but it was madness.
I'd love for you to talk about that Binyam Mohammad case of the bucket and the uranium, because that just shows how some of these confessions were
Can I tell you just
out.
2 stories on that? Because there are hundreds, right? But these 2 are great. And Binyam is a really important one. And the reason it's important is it is true that Americans were totally obsessed with WMD after 9/11, and you can sort of understand it, right? So Binyam was a British guy whose family was originally from Ethiopia, but he was British. And he'd grown up in the whole context. He's very obstinate. I love Binyam. He's a great sense of humor. And so he gets sold for a bounty by your dear ex-president Musharraf. And the Americans start interrogating him. And Binyam says, I know my rights. I'm not talking to you. And they say, you don't have any rights now. And he said, yeah, I do. And so anyway, they start abusing him. They say, what do you know about nuclear weapons? And I don't know anything about nuclear weapons. And this goes on for a long time, and they're beating him up and whatever. Finally, he says, well, I tell you what, once I did read something in a magazine about how to build a nuclear bomb. And they obviously get really excited about this point. How's your physics? Did you do a physics A level or not?
I've not managed to separate uranium in a bucket, if that helps you.
You're so bad. What do you do with your time in the studio? You could get the bucket going up here. So what happened is Binyam says, what you do is you put uranium in a bucket, spin it around your head for 45 minutes. That separates your uranium-235 from uranium-239. Don't put all your uranium in the same bucket. And you've got Bob's your uncle. You got weapons grade, uranium. And he tells me this story. And I was a physicist early on in life, but you don't have to be. And I thought it was the stupidest thing I ever heard. So I Google it, right? And I find in Google that this woman wrote this spoof article in 1972 about how to build a nuclear bomb. And she was in an old people's home at that point, but I tracked down her daughter, who wrote for the LA Times. And I told her this story, and she then wrote a lovely piece in the LA Times about how my mum was behind the nuclear bomb plot. And Binyam was facing the death penalty in Guantanamo for a nuclear bomb plot and all the rest of it. And we gradually beat them down because they took him to Morocco to get him to tell more about this, where are your legs crossed? They took him to Morocco and they took a razor blade to his genitals every 2 weeks for a year and a half. And I don't know when you would start confessing to your nuclear habits, but this was just horrifying. And gradually, as we exposed all of this, they came from death to life to 20 years. And then the prosecutors came to me and they said, if you plead guilty, we'll just give you 1 day in prison, then you go home. And I said to them, if you're going to do that, you're just going to let us go home anyhow. So they did. And actually, to their credit, those 2 prosecutors who were hard-ass prosecutors in the military both resigned and both had a road to Damascus where they became great advocates against Guantanamo. That's one story. My second story, which I'm really proud of, because it's just one of my favorites, a wonderful story about Pakistan. So there's this kid, Mohammad Al Gherani.
14-year-old boy from Karachi, right?
14. Yes. You have been really reading. This is slightly horrifying how well informed you are. So he was.
Where were you on the night of September 10th?
I'm going to be asking you. I think he's coming after me, guys. I expect to be arrested at the end of this interview. Anyway, Mohammad Al Gherani was actually Chadian, and he was born in Saudi. But in Saudi, which kind of makes Mississippi look good when it comes to racism, he couldn't get a secondary education. So he decided to come to Karachi, and he saved some money up and he came down here and he was going to learn English and computers. But very soon after he landed, he's taken in for a bounty and sold to the Americans. And this is my favorite part. In the early days of this, I've seen all their secret intelligence, right? And I really do obey their rules. I don't reveal stuff that's not public, even though it's crazy. I wish I could. So he's being interrogated and he speaks Arabic from Saudi, and they use an Arabic speaker from Yemen. And I'm no expert in this, but I understand that the word zalat in Yemeni Arabic means money. But in Saudi Arabic, it means salad or tomatoes. So they start interrogating this kid and they say, when you went from Saudi to Pakistan, what zalat did you have with you? Never met a white person before, and he thinks these people are wacko. And he says, I didn't have any zalat. And they said, you had to have zalat when you went there. And he says, no, I could get zalat anywhere I needed it in Pakistan. So because they're in the CIA, they leap to the conclusion that he's an al-Qaeda financier. So they get very excited and they say, where could you get zalat in Karachi? And he lists a series of vegetable stalls here in Karachi. And they write this down. And this becomes the big expose of where the al-Qaeda financiers are. And they decide he's a 26-year-old al-Qaeda financier. And that's how he ends up in Guantanamo until I got in and represented him. And we got a birth certificate, which I thought was brilliant investigation.
You're a real Chad as well. I don't know if you get the internet Gen Z reference. That's like a real guy on internet. It's called a Chad. So,
oh, really? No, yes. I haven't. No, you're educating me.
Since we've sidetracked on the Musharraf part, the fact that he showed it, and not to scare you further, but page 244 in your paperback, in Musharraf's In the Line of Fire, he boasts about the fact that he sold Pakistanis for $50,000. At times, you've said it's $250,000 was offered to people. No. So the incentive is too much.
It went up to 20 million with al-Shaykh Mohammad. Yeah.
So the incentive is right there, right? Because you could offer anybody else.
So here we go,
money.
Shehzad. I'm going to offer you $250,000 for you to say that chap over there was in Tora Bora.
Like much less.
$50, $50.
No, good cup of coffee.
All right, you're gone, mate. It is. I mean, it's something, and of course, it's typical of the Americans. We pay money. I found it fascinating up in Waziristan when I was doing the drones work up there to work out who was snitching on who and why. And I remember I did a thing with Imran Khan, a jirga we did in Islamabad. on drones, and all these people, instead of going up to Waziristan, which was very hard at the time, we invited them all down to this hotel. And we were doing this thing, and I said to everyone there, you know, I'm going to tell you how the CIA works. There are 2 people in this audience who are working for the CIA right now, and they're going to snitch on people. And the way it works is they're never going to snitch on a really bad guy, because that's dangerous. They're going to snitch on one of you. And the way we'll know what they said is what the press release says the next day. The Americans will blow you up with the drone, and then the next day there'll be a press release, and that's going to be what the snitch said. And I said this, and everyone starts looking at each other, you know, suspiciously. And I made it up, obviously, but it's how they work. But what was truly scary about that was there's a kid called Tariq Ali there who I talked to, and he was there because his cousin had been droned, and he just wanted to know how to stop it. And 2 days later, there was a drone attack where the Americans had obviously said they'd got their snitch, and the snitch had said there were 4 militants in this car, and that was the press release. They blew the car up. It was Tariq and his cousin, his other cousin, who was younger. He was 16, the other kid was 14, and had been blown up. And obviously one of the people at that jirga had snitched on him. And, you know, I'd been making this other stuff up. I thought that's what they did, but it never occurred to me really that this was going to happen to someone in our audience. And it did. And it's so sad. You know, I feel we ought to do a monument to this poor kid in Islamabad, really, just to teach people the folly of all this stuff.
I mean, it's rather ironic that a lot of the people who tend to be anti-American, pro-religion in Pakistan also tend to be pro-Musharraf for some reason, whereas he was not only selling Pakistanis and boasting about it, and he was, I don't know if you know this anecdote, but he was well aware of the fact that that is something that would not be well received in Pakistan. So the line that you talk about is not in the Urdu copy.
Exactly. It's in the English copy.
It's just in the English copy of his autobiography. So he knows for a fact that this would not be well received in Pakistan, but somehow he's still a hero.
Although I think he knows also, I was doing a fundraiser for the JPP. I don't know if you know.
Yes, Sarah Bilal.
Sarah. Yeah. And she made me sit at the table of the old people, which I really always held against her. And I was talking to this guy who was meant to be a donor for her. And he was meant to be some liberal guy. And I was saying, you know, you'd be shocked. We Americans have killed 3,400 of your citizens, and you're meant to be our ally. And he said to me, he said, well, you know, they are our friends, the Americans. I think they should be allowed to kill maybe 30,000 before we get upset. And, you know, that's horrifying, really, isn't it?
I mean, it's your birthday. You get one salala every year.
Yeah, you get 1,000 Pakistanis you can kill for your birthday. Great.
It's the one thing we have. We don't have money. We have Pakistanis. So it's the one thing we can lose for dollars without really any repercussion, especially when we're a military dictatorship. Nobody's going to ask where.
I always think they're aiming for me. So while I'm in this studio with you, maybe we can get 3 Pakistanis and an American, and, you know, that'll be good.
Maybe after the podcast, I'll tell you the message I got after I announced that you're coming on the podcast. So Musharraf's terrible, we know. America's terrible, we know. So let's go back to Aafia's story, right? That thing about fundraising for Bosnia, which again, she might not be aware, but one of the organizations, one of their branches in another country was found to be guilty of funding the 1998 bombings, right?
Oh, I don't know even about that. That was long before. Yes. And, you know, look, she was doing relief work. Well, she was trying to. She wanted to go to Bosnia to help, but she didn't. She wasn't able to go. But, you know, look, how many people do you know who did that? Half of the people I've ever represented went to Bosnia. And what you have to remember is Bill Clinton did too. He was the one who sent Americans in there. So I don't think that was ever considered to be a serious part of the assertions against her. The one that really began all this was the search of their flat in...
After they bought, you mentioned the night vision goggles, but they also bought body armor. They also bought a bunch of military books, including the anarchist arsenal.
I've got that, by the way. I always wondered about it because
I mean, you don't walk to Target and spend $10,000, right? For people who are not Americans. That's not also a small amount.
You know, the bigger thing, though, was actually just a few days later where there was $70,000 came
from a Saudi account to Amjad Khan's account. Right?
And I've got to say, you know, Amjad, you know, he said this stuff was his, with the exception of some things. And I'm amazed they weren't taken into custody. I'm amazed he wasn't taken into custody right then, because this was 2002. It was very soon after everything happened. And frankly, I'm not sure why they weren't. But anyway, that was certainly got on their list. And actually, it's interesting. I've talked to both the American secret people and your ISI guy. And the only one who thought that was serious was the guy from the ISI. They thought, I'm amazed these guys haven't been, that Amjad Khan wasn't arrested on the spot.
So for people who don't know the reference, Amjad Khan and Aafia went down to the store, bought a bunch of stuff. They said it was for hunting. Amjad Khan goes hunting.
That's what Amjad said.
Is there any evidence that he has been hunting and that's what it was for? Because based on what you've said, you seem to be skeptical of Amjad Khan's intentions and what he was going to do with it.
Well, look, I'm slightly skeptical about everything along those lines because, they end up going through an incredibly bitter divorce. I don't think under anyone's definition, Amjad Khan is going to get Father of the Year award. The thing to me, there are some things you know and some things you don't know. The one thing I know is that Amjad, when his children were later abducted in 2003, did absolutely nothing to try and get them back. And actually, the little factoid that gets me the most as a parent myself is rather than try to get his little daughter Mariam back, who was age 3, he'd just got divorced. He went and got married to someone else and had another girl and called her Mariam. I mean, there's something fundamentally weird about that. But there's something that's caught on camera that's actually very interesting. He and Ahmed, the son, had a very bad relationship. For some reason, Amjad hated his son. I don't know why. And when Fawzia got Amjad back, there was only one time got Ahmed back. There's only one time that Amjad ever came to try and see his children. The kid started
crying and said, he's the guy who used to torture me in Afghanistan.
Yeah, which I'm sure he wasn't. But he had grown a big, long beard and looked.
It's kind of weird for the kid to scream that this is the same guy who used to torture me in Afghanistan.
No, I know. It is weird. But if you saw that, and no one's faking it.
Yeah.
And so, look, he wasn't the guy who I don't think who was torturing him in Afghanistan, but I think that says a lot of the emotional relationship between this child and his father. And I don't think we're blaming the father. So going back to your question, look, there's a divorce that goes back and forth. Different people say different ones were more extreme. It is in the records that she wanted her children to go to regular schools and he didn't. Now, what that tells you, he wanted them to go to religious schools. But I don't know about all of that. And I prefer to look at these things about the really solid facts. And, there are people who go to religious schools who aren't extremist maniacs. So let's not assume that makes him a lunatic. I do think the one thing that makes a lot of sense is that both he and Aafia end up on the FBI Most Wanted list. And I now know why Aafia was on it because I got it from the horse's mouth in America. And I think we know why Amjad was on it, that was all built up from the stuff in Boston and so forth. And what that tends to tell you is when you get down to the bit about Amjad saying that he's seen Aafia and his kids wandering around Karachi for 5 years between 2003, 2008, I can tell you as an absolute fact that's false. So because I got...
Let's stick to the timeline because I feel like we're losing.
Right.
So we're in this pre-9/11 world. Let's not get into the divorce of it.
All right.
Aafia Siddiqui claims that he was abusive to Aafia.
There's some evidence of that, but so on.
I think it was reported once, right? The police that
there
were signs
more than once, and she went to hospital. But,
From Amjad Khan's perspective, she had some issues. She thought people were trying to convert Muslims into Christians. She thought she wanted to go to Bosnia. According to Amjad, she had gone full-blown jihadi, and it was scary. Things happen.
None of that came up until way later, right? So
regardless, when people get separated, they say all kinds of things about each other. 9/11 happens. They come to Pakistan.
Yeah.
And then she goes back. You've said that the Majid Khan PO Box story is a complete lie, but it was reported in the Guardian, right?
Oh, look. dear old Declan got everything wrong in that story.
Okay.
That was very early on. No, there's another thing you missed before then. So after 9/11, they both go back, right?
Mm.
They go back in 2002 because Amjad has to finish his training. And that's when the whole business starts, when they're buying the things and the $70,000 transfer from Saudi.
Was
happened.
that ever investigated where the $70,000 came from?
No. And I mean, I know they must have looked into it.
They must have.
One of the things I'm going to get in Discovery and all of this stuff, because I want it, is I want to know what they found at that point, because that's interesting. But then they come back to Pakistan. And then, Aafia does go briefly back, very briefly, in 2003. And Uzair Paracha, we all know Uzair. I represented his dad. I'm going to go see him in a few minutes when we're through with this.
Saifullah. You were with Saifullah Paracha a while back as well, right? In Islamabad?
Oh, I've not in Islamabad. Here, I've been
the IPS session. It wasn't the last year's session.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Was that in Afghanistan? Oh, look, I'm old and grey in my memory. So, what we know is this: Uzair was accused of all this stuff with Majid Khan, and he did several years in prison. And then, I was involved in that in the sense of when it came back, and it was reversed because everyone said, well, this was under torture. It's just not true. The US offered him time served if he just pled and he could go on home, and he wouldn't do that. And at the time, I was encouraging him to do it because I know how the American system works. I say, look, get out of here. And he just wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it because he said, all of this is nonsense. And the Americans eventually accepted that, dismissed all the charges, and he came home. Incidentally, didn't get any sort of apology. I've talked to Majid Khan. He's in Belize right now. And, he was released. I talked to him quite a lot. I actually want him to sign an affidavit, but his current lawyers won't let him do it. There's rubbish about...
Is the story that the PO Box was created rubbish, or is the story that Majid Khan was a financier for Al-Qaeda rubbish?
No, the story that Aafia was doing that and that Uzair was doing that is rubbish.
But Majid Khan was involved.
Majid Khan was closely related to al-Shaykh Mohammad, right? Now, I don't know all the facts, and I always hate to judge people if I don't know all the facts, but I think it would be hard-pressed to say that Majid had nothing to do with anything. And the poor guy suffered enough for that, and he's now out, thankfully.
And there's absolutely no relation, no conversation between Uzair Paracha, Aafia Siddiqui, Majid Khan.
No. Uzair and Aafia didn't know each other at all. So and it goes on, because then you get into the Ammar Al Balochi stuff, which is right after that.
Let's just get into that. You've said it's complete rubbish. Aafia Siddiqui has claimed that it was the last day of it, that it couldn't have possibly been true. But Ammar Al Balochi's family has confirmed it. Pakistani US intelligence has confirmed it. Let's not trust them at all. But according to the FBI report submitted in the courts, Aafia Siddiqui herself admitted to it.
No. Look, the thing about the Ammar Al Balochi thing, obviously...
For people who don't know, the argument is that
they were married.
Aafia Siddiqui and Ammar Al Balochi, who's the nephew of Khalid Mohammed Sheikh, were married.
Right. And it goes further than that, right? The theory, and it was really presented at her trial, the theory as to why she ended up in Afghanistan later was that she was searching for her husband. So let's go through that whole story in the round. Now, look, obviously, I'm in Guantanamo. I get to talk to people. I get to talk to whoever I want to. What they say about Ammar Al Balochi married to her is just never happened. Now, I'm not quite sure how it generated. And, in terms of all the false statements by various people, I haven't talked to all his family to see where that stuff came from. But if you compare it to whether Binyam Mohammad created a nuclear bomb, this would be a fairly small falsehood. But it didn't happen. But far more importantly, the whole theory against Aafia is that she's going to Ghazni to find her husband when that whole incident that we'll get to comes up. Ammar Al Balochi was arrested in 2003 and he was in Guantanamo in 2006. So by 2008, she's not going to be wandering around Afghanistan looking for her husband, Ammar Al Balochi. It's all nonsense, that.
But I mean, if the follow-up story is bullshit, that doesn't necessarily disprove the fact that they got married years ago.
No, but it doesn't. But I'm telling you.
Why would Ammar Al Balochi's family confirm it then?
Well, why would Ammar Al Balochi say it's rubbish? which way round do you want to believe it? I don't mind. And, it's all nonsense.
So the FBI documents which are submitted in the court, which claim that Aafia admitted it, is also...
Total nonsense.
Is that not in the documents, or are you saying that is in the documents?
Well, I've actually never seen any document that says that. But regardless, it's rubbish.
It's
total rubbish. It is one of
what's the least... I'm sorry, but I will be asking you these questions. I hope you don't...
I don't mind.
What's the evidence that it's rubbish? The fact that something happened 2008, years later?
No. It's, it's the burden of proof is on the government to prove that that's happened. If there was, then presumably there'd be some evidence of them getting married. We've never seen any evidence of them getting married. The family said, the Fawzia and them said it never happened. I found no evidence that it happened here in Pakistan. So where is the proof they got married? Now, if the family's saying, whoever these family are, I don't know who they are, I've never talked to them, but if they're saying, Ammar was married to her, that's probably in some document after they've been interrogated somewhat significantly by whomever, when their child is in Guantanamo Bay as one of the great terrorists of the 21st century. I'm not going to believe pretty much anything on that, because I'll give you an example. And this is not about this case, but it's illustrative. The frustration I have when I talk about these things is I see the secret evidence, as I said, and normally I can't talk about it, which is really annoying because when, what's his face, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, I thought they were releasing what I see, and instead they were releasing just the sort of wet dreams of what the military made up about them. And the only one I can tell you all the details on is a guy I represented in Morocco called Younus Chekhouri. Younus, there was a 13-page document that the military had saying he was the head of the GICM and all these terrorist groups in Morocco. And they had 13 pages, right? I had 1,811 pages of their materials proving this was, and I'm going to use a legal term here, total bullshit. I had 150 pages for each page they had showing it was rubbish, right? Now, I can now show you that because I made a huge effort to get all of that declassified simply so I could show you guys what I get to see. And, it's extraordinary. You've already agreed you're going to sell poor old Farouk for $50 or a cup of coffee. But where some of this evidence comes from, and I have some sympathy. I've represented a few snitches in my time. People are getting promised astounding things, some of which are pretty astounding, like watching porn films in Guantanamo. But
that was an actual perk.
That was a real perk, right?
I mean, there's something to say about the...
Are you about to go say you want to go to Guantanamo? Where are we going?
Maybe there's something to say about people who claim that porn makes you violent, because apparently they also found porn in Osama bin Laden's Abbottabad compound. So.
Probably. I'm never quite sure about that, whether it's true or whether they're just trying to make him look
Maybe
sleazy.
there is a link to watching Mia Khalifa and wanting to be a Khalifa.
There's a lot of science in this room. So, I don't know. I've seen so much nonsense. And, there's lots of stuff in Aafia's case. I mean, my clemency petition is 56,600 words. I just filed a 21,000 word supplement. That is the novel already. It's 80,000 words.
So have you seen the musical Hamilton?
Ah, yes.
How do you write like you're running out of time, Clive? How do you write like you're running out of time? Going back to the timeline, and anytime I miss a piece, please do.
Sure.
So this is happening beginning of March, first 10 days. Khalid Maqbool Sheikh gets picked up. Khalid Maqbool Sheikh names Aafia Siddiqui, right?
By the 18th, right?
Okay.
Now, when you look at the timeline...
the time he's been waterboarded 183 times.
Exactly. And, one of the interesting things which came out of one person who I won't name is that he told me that he named Aafia Siddiqui.
By her full name?
By her full name.
Okay.
And he named it, and he told me how. Now, I'm not saying this is what happened, but, when I first got involved in Gitmo, I thought, if I'm saying these guys are not telling the truth, why did it come about? And the whole bounty business was a real revelation to me when I learned about that, because that began to explain why they made so many mistakes. In Aafia's case, there are some other things that I've come across which are very interesting and I hadn't really thought about before. This guy told me that he was shown a whole series of picture books with names on them, right? And there were lots of men and one woman. And the woman had Aafia Siddiqui underneath it. And he said that he named Aafia Siddiqui
because they thought they wouldn't torture a woman.
That's what he thought. Now, that's weird. And he was quite apologetic for having said that. It makes sense, I suppose.
So the argument for why would Khalid Maqbool Sheikh know that Aafia Siddiqui exists is that they showed it.
No, well, that's possible. I wasn't there, and I haven't talked to old Hamza, as they call him in Guantanamo, about that. But he later said it was all nonsense. Now,
but pre-March, pre-Khalid Maqbool Sheikh saying, and for people who don't know, he's the mastermind of 9/11, right? Fair to say that? So, terrible, reprehensible person.
Yeah. Well,
why would Aafia Siddiqui be one of the people that are being shown to him?
Oh, because, this is easy. Now, this is what I have reconstructed is when you start talking to them first about what we discussed, the nuclear bomb plot, which had already happened well over a year before. They thought she was a nuclear person. Then they have the blood diamonds thing, right? You know about that, right?
No.
Oh, right. Oh, this is fabulous. So there's a massive thing, and it ends up coming bizarrely from the UN, that the UN has this whole thing about Al-Qaeda getting blood diamonds from Liberia. And central in that was Gherani. You remember Gherani, who ends up being prosecuted in America, and Aafia Siddiqui. And these are two people who are meant to be working together in Liberia for Al-Qaeda, right? And this was the second really big thing that made the Americans think Aafia was, the dark lady of Al-Qaeda. And so they had two witnesses who identified Gherani and Aafia, they said. Now, the FBI got in trouble for this when it came out because, the Americans said, why are we learning this from the UN? Why haven't you found it out? So they sent a team of 15 people to Liberia. They might have just begun by asking Aafia because we have physical evidence that on the date they say she was doing blood diamonds in Liberia, she was undergoing a scan in Boston. But anyway, the FBI go to Liberia, discover it's all total nonsense. They talk to the eyewitnesses, show them pictures, and they say, no, it's not this Gherani guy and not this Aafia Siddiqui person. And all of that, there's a big, long FBI report of them debunking that whole thing. Interestingly, though, if you then look at the later intelligence that the US has, they're still saying it, right? Even after the FBI's debunked it. So by the time we get to early 2003, you've got Boston, you've got this fantasy about nuclear weapons, and you've got the blood diamonds, which was a big deal. And so Aafia's on their radar, right? And she's clearly on the radar of the ISI as well for that. Now, the ISI guy who I have on this says, I never believed that. That struck me as total nonsense. But there is a very complicated story I'm not going to go into here. And the reason I'm not is because it's really embarrassing for the ISI. And I've promised not to do this. And you know why? I'm going to tell you why. I want the world to know, but I'm not going to tell you the story. I have promised the Pakistan government that if they behave themselves and if they support us properly on the clemency petition for Aafia,
you won't expose them.
There are certain dirty secrets I'm not to expose. And they're pretty dirty secrets. And boy, would I like to. I'm afraid I really enjoy this stuff.
I'm torn.
I know. But I've got to do... when I promise...
We do want Aafia, but then we want the dirty secrets also.
We do, and I want to write the book.
Both?
I'd like to do the movie. I want to be played by a young, handsome person in the movie. But no, I've got...
Richard Gere.
And he's getting a bit old now. No,
wow, Clive. I was being kind to you.
I don't think that's kind at all. Now, Richard Gere, I'd take him 30 years ago, coming out of the water with a sort of massively butch chest or something. Anyway, so the bottom line is there are some things that are really quite embarrassing for the ISI, which I find very entertaining, and I hope at some point I can tell you them. So all of this builds up, though, and you now know why they're looking at Aafia, and you know why they're interrogating KSM and others. And I think now, I don't have any physical proof of this, that I think KSM identified Aafia as being involved in something. I think they did, because that's why it's got to be why. When you look at the timeline and you've got March, 13th to 18th, when we know he says something about her because it's in the Senate report, then you go just 12 days later is when she gets abducted. It would be quite a coincidence if that wasn't related.
But he did. I mean, you're skeptical of it, but that's the idea, because I believe Aafia Siddiqui
I think he said
said that he was just reciting Quran and the word Aafia came, and that's how they associate it.
I don't know where they get that from. I mean, I've never heard that. But yeah.
So then the arrest warrants are issued for both, right? And they question Amjad Khan.
Not arrest warrants, the
most wanted
thing.
They question Amjad Khan, and now we've already laid the fact that he got 70,000 in his account, and the FBI clears him.
Yeah. So he sits down and talks to the ISI for quite a long time, according to him, and they were satisfied that he was telling the truth. When you look at, there are a few things coming up, obviously, in Pakistan about different people who say different things, and he's the big one. One of the things that's interesting about the witness I talked to last week about Bagram in Afghanistan was he told me a whole new story, which we'll get to, about what happened to her. But he also told me that she said at the time in Bagram that it seems to have been her husband who got her in all this trouble and got her, who knows, that may be part of the divorce story. But
I mean, not to overestimate American competence, but the FBI sees all of this, sees what they bought, sees the money coming in, and then they clear Amjad Khan.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because if the idea is that, which may not be untrue as well, that we just Pakistanis see some money and sell our friends and we don't really care about whose lives we destroy for dollars, why would we save Amjad Khan? We'd just get another $50,000 and send him away as well, right?
No, totally. But I think I think it's pretty clear that he started saying Aafia was the bad person and, whatever. And I don't know what support he had. Who knows? I would love, seriously.
So we don't know what the FBI might have known to clear him. We don't have any information or documents.
No.
So why would the FBI clear him?
Very good question. It's very hard to clear someone. If you've got if he said that he was the one who bought the stuff, he said that he was the one who got this guy to send the money because it was something owed that he was going to pay off.
$70,000.
$70,000. He said that, right? We know he said that because it's in black and white. So once you've said it, how do you prove it's not true, or how do you prove it's innocent? That's tough. I've had clients go to prison for a long time for far less than that. So I don't know. Something's going on there. I have my suspicions, but they're not fact.
So for that period where, since we've already talked about that, let's get into that, where you say that he was shown a picture of Aafia at the Islamabad airport and he confirmed that it was her. And then the thing that you mentioned, that he saw them in traffic. His argument is that I was told by the intelligence agencies that this is the best thing to do for their safety. So let's disregard his let's disregard his testimony. He's a jaded ex-husband. Hell hath no fury like an ex-scorned.
Yeah.
But the uncle, Shamsul Hasan.
Yeah. No, total rubbish, right?
So for the people who don't know.
So the uncle says that she came to see him she came to see the uncle in Islamabad, and I forget exactly what date it was, but it was, during the 2003-2008 time. Now, I don't know. I've been wanting to talk to that uncle to see why he said that, but I know it's not true.
Yes, Farooq.
So he submitted a declaration in the court that he didn't give any explicit statement.
Shamsul, so for people who can't listen, Farooq हमारे आफिया movement के एक रुकन है. He is saying that Shamsul Hasan की जो reported story है Guardian में, Shamsul Hasan has said that I did not say that.
Right.
Okay.
No, that is true. But again, all I'm saying...
For people who don't know, Shamsul Hasan in the Declan Wash Guardian article said that Aafia came to me and she said that I was working for the Al-Qaeda. Now the ISI is trying to turn me, but I don't want to.
Right.
But now Farooq is saying that Shamsul Hasan gave an affidavit. If he'll give it to us, we'll put it up as well. That he said no such thing. Right, Farooq?
Yeah. And so the question is, what's true? Now there are two ways.
Have you managed to talk to him? Not at all.
No, I haven't.
Okay.
But what Farooq says is true. But look, you've got two ways of disproving something. You can believe him and his affidavit now, if you want to. You know, he said one, according to Declan, he said one thing, according to him, that's not true. Declan's a good journalist, but his entire story is wrong. And that's not because he's a bad journalist, it's because of what was known at the time. The second way of looking at whether what the uncle says is true and whether Amjad says is true, and Amjad's, of course, is that he sees his children in Karachi and does nothing about it. You could believe that if you believe in Santa Claus. But the second way to look at it is to look at what we now know, right? Now, we know that she and the children were abducted here on March the 30th. I have a tape recording of one of the agents who did it, right? And you've seen that. And we know that there's not a single instance of someone who was abducted like that for the Americans, who then the Americans said, all right, you can go home now. That just never happened to anyone. We know that now, because I've been to Afghanistan and my focus has all been on seeing whether we can prove that the CIA had her. And I got now 9 witnesses in Bagram. I got a whole series of other witnesses who say she was there. I have Hamid Karzai saying that he rescued the daughter, Mariam, in 2010. So that's
Josh and Natalie.
Sorry?
From Josh and Natalie.
Yeah. And Natasha. I keep getting that name wrong. I don't know why I can't get the name right, but it's Natasha. So, right, you know, we know she was held there, and there's all sorts of... I have a fabulous thing that I just got, which is one of those little things that's absolutely compelling. One of the bits of evidence that they tried to use at her later trial was how to shoot down satellites, right? How do you shoot down a satellite?
You abuse Elon Musk on Twitter, and he'll get angry, and he'll put one Starlink suffers every time Elon Musk gets angry.
You are a strategic genius. I would never have thought of that. I think you'd also get a drone and drone you.
Probably.
But look, she wrote a thing that's used against her at trial, where she wrote something about how you get lots of missiles and you fire them up and knock the satellite out of the sky.
Aafia wrote it.
Aafia wrote it. And there's no question it's in her handwriting, and there's no question what it's on. And so, you know, that was used against her at trial. Well, I was curious about this, right? So I went and got the original magazine that it's written on, which I had to pay £27 on eBay for. And it turns out that what she wrote on a page of this Discover magazine, which the heading, just in case you need to know, is How to Cure Aging. You know, I don't see a lot of gray in your hair yet, but you may need it at some point. So
you don't need it. You look better than Richard Gere.
I do need it. I'm 65. I'm going downhill rapidly. My cricket career is close to over. Anyway, on this Discover magazine, on this page, you clearly can identify she's handwritten this stuff about shooting things out of the sky. The very page before is exactly what she wrote. So she copied it down on the magazine page, right? But the crucial thing is this Discover magazine is a print magazine from December 2007, only available in the United States. Couldn't get it in Pakistan, Balochistan, wherever she was wandering around. And now she's always said that she was forced to write things out by the Americans when she was being tortured. Here's physical evidence that what she said is true. Now, we'll get more in the end. If they make me go through the whole litigation on this, I'm going to get in front of a nice, liberal, elderly Jewish judge in New York City who's going to be pissed off that the CIA lied to him, and he's going to order all this stuff out. And I'm going to get to see it just like I've seen all the stuff in Guantanamo, and then the world is going to learn what really happened. But this is just one very small part of a very big jigsaw puzzle that we know beyond any doubt that those children were abducted. They were taken to Afghanistan. She was taken to Afghanistan. She was tortured for 5 years. Where's Suleiman, the 6-month-old? He's never reappeared. We know this all happened. And anyone who says it didn't happen is just a fantasist.
So for going back to the timeline, she's going to Islamabad for a conference for some of the work that she's done. on the way to the Karachi airport, ISI on behalf of CIA, that's the story, right?
Yeah.
Correct me anytime I get wrong.
No, that's right.
They pull her out. Ahmed, who's 5 at that time, looks out, sees splatter of blood, and assumes that Suleiman, the child who was 6 months, I believe, at that time, falls and potentially dies. We don't know that for a fact.
That's actually the only evidence. And he's a traumatized little, 6 years old, actually. Traumatized little kid. So, you know, that may be true, maybe not true. And I thought it was true for years, right? When I learned about this, I thought, well, obviously the kid died. But then when you learn what happened to these kids, you begin to think, wow, you know, maybe it's not true. So we'll talk about that.
So they
Go ahead.
pick Aafia up, move her to Bagram.
But before you do, can I just ask you, have you got kids?
No.
None that you're admitting to.
None that I know of.
Yeah. No, look, and you don't have to have kids for this, right? But I've got to say that I don't think I, as an emotionless Brit, understood what love was until I had a son. I've got one son. And, you know, most people do because they're not unemotionalist bastards like me. But I now do get it. And one thing that the Spanish Inquisition taught us, and we've unfortunately done a lot of, is learn about second-degree torture. And the thing that I think every listener out there will understand is when they abducted Aafia and her 3 children, it's the 3 children that traumatized her more than being tortured herself. And of all the 150-odd cases I've done in this war of terror, as Borat calls it, this is what gets me about Aafia, is the idea of taking her 3 kids, maybe killing the youngest, taking Mariam, the 3-year-old, changing her name to Fatima and putting her in a Christian family in Kabul, taking the son and putting him in prison. Age 6. And when you read her records, and I've now got 1,500 pages of her medical records in prison, she talks about saving her lunch of turkey for her son, Ahmed. You know, this is in 2008. And she's totally traumatized by what happened to her children. And, you know, honestly, I don't have to go beyond that. There are lots of other things to talk about. But in terms of the abuse that this poor woman has gone through, we don't have to get to the rapes. We don't have to get to the truth of the nonsense in Ghazni. We don't have to get to anything else, even her own torture. The idea that we as Americans did that to her children is just beyond the pale.
Before just getting into Bagram, since you've mentioned it, you mentioned that she was raped by Afghan guards. She was at Bagram. Were there Afghan guards there, or that happens later?
No, that happens later.
Okay.
So it goes in 3 stages. We now know, because I got a series of witnesses and I filmed it all at Bagram. In the original Bagram place, you know, I know that very well. I represented scores of people who were in there. And I went there and we filmed it all in the ISO place, and it was with one guy who was in the ISO chambers with her.
Salim.
Tipu, it was. But the Salim Kuche was there too.
Kuche was there.
There's a whole series of people, right?
Yes. Mozam was there, right?
Mozam was there afterwards. He wasn't there when she was there at that time, although he was there. No, he left before, sorry.
Didn't he mention that he heard the screams and he thought it was his wife, but then later he found out it was Aafia?
No. There was something about that years ago in the film by Yvonne Ridley, but that's just wrong. Okay. The 650 thing's wrong. That's just...
The 650 thing's wrong?
Wrong, totally wrong, yeah. And you can prove that's wrong.
Okay.
And you can do it because I've got the records, right? And whoever was prisoner 650 was in there before Aafia could have been in 2002. So there's all sorts of rumors.
So there was a woman at Bagram that people heard screaming who's 650, who's not Aafia.
No, there's no proof that it's a woman.
Okay.
The 650 comes from only one source, and I won't tell you which that is because that's part of this nonsense. But that all was compounded, and actually it only comes from one place, and I just think they all got it wrong. They all tell a story that's consistent with the date that Aafia was there, not when 650 was there, that I just think they had the number wrong. So, you know, that's just a red herring, as so many things are. And that's why it's important before we start telling the story to evaluate all of this stuff. So, and there was an interesting thing in Yvonne's work, and I admire Yvonne Ridley. She did a lot of good stuff investigating in 2009 when it was dangerous. But the Americans said, without identifying the woman or whether it was a woman or whatever, says that 650 has been set free. Now, I know that's true because I got the records, because we sued America and got the records of the prisoners in Bagram back then. So that's a red herring. So Aafia was in the ISO chamber in Bagram for a while. Lots of people say that. I got a witness to talk about the secret part of Bagram, surprisingly, 2 visits to Afghanistan ago. One of the governors of one of the provinces of Afghanistan who wouldn't go on record, but he told me all about it. And I'd never heard about the underground dark prison in Bagram. And he told me about another place he was taken to the UAE, which I'd never heard of. And I do think it's an important job that I'm going to do, which is get the historical record of all these spaces. So anyway, I was interested when he told me that. On this trip that I just came back from, I got a witness who was there and who was willing to tell me, and told me totally consistent story, that he signed an affidavit of about being taken. He was a guy who was just totally nobody, right? And so he kept saying it. And the more they abused him, he kept saying, I'm innocent. And the Americans hated that. So they ended up transferring him from the ISO unit of Bagram to the dark prison underground in Bagram that this other guy had told me about. And he says, yeah, and there I was in there, and so was Aafia Siddiqui. Now, she had explained to me, and I hadn't published it anywhere, the same thing. So that was very interesting. He's told me about names of a number of other people who were there then, so I'm now tracing them down. So the way it goes is she's first held in the Bagram bit, the open bit in the ISO unit. Then she's held underground in the secret bit, which interestingly, the Secret Service guy from America who's told me about it, who was stationed in Bagram, didn't know about. So the CIA was keeping that stuff very quiet. And then she's taken from there to an Afghan detention place. Well, it's a CIA place. The real dark prison was in Kabul, right? That's where Binyam and others were. And it was run by the CIA, but the guards were Afghans. And Aafia has described a similar thing with women. And she told me stories about, for example, there were 3 of them in a cell, and the Afghan guards would come and rape them. And then they got together. They couldn't really talk very well. She didn't speak Pashto, but they figured it out. They tied each other's wrists together. And when the guard came in to rape them, they took him down, beat the hell out of him. And, I was kind of proud of her. But that, then they separated them into single cells and carried on abusing them there. That's the story she tells. I haven't yet found that place. I think I know where it is from my most recent visit. And what I've done, which, I think will bear fruit, is I'm publishing in Tolo there little stories about each of the people. I know about Ahmed, I know about Mariam, and I know the facts from Aafia. They're going to be people who can corroborate those facts. And so, I haven't told the whole story in these pieces. I just say where it is. So then when people come forward, I can question them and hopefully they'll tell the truth.
The evidence that she was at Bagram is all these people saying that. How did they know that was Aafia Siddiqui?
She said so. I mean, she was in the ISO place with some of them.
How did they recognize her?
Well, look, there are 2 different ways, right? There's a couple of people, not all of them, who were there and actually talked to her, they say. And, yeah, you can believe them or not. But then there's other people who were in the ISO unit who saw her. You could, I know what those cells looked like. They had wood down the side, but you could see people being taken out. Then there's a number of people who were on what was called the main floor downstairs, and she would be taken. And I know this is true because I knew this 15 years ago from Shakarama and people, that to go to the toilet or to go for showers, you had to go along the whole cage system out to the place at the back. She would be taken out there. They would try and put a towel over her head, but they did it all the time, and a lot of people saw her. And then, she wasn't shouting out, my name is Aafia Siddiqui at that point, but those people heard from the others it was Aafia, and then saw the picture later when she was on TV. So there's a lot of people who say that. And to dismiss that, you got to believe a lot of people are making stuff up. Now, and you've got to also have an alternative story. And, I find these people pretty credible.
Okay, so before we get to Ghazni, the Americans have her at Bagram, or then they put her in the dark. So Americans rightfully, wrongfully think that she's the lady of Al-Qaeda. She's the mother of Al-Qaeda. They have her in her presence. Why do the Ghazni thing? Why let her go? Why stage that?
So, this is typical. This happened a lot in the whole business, right? We did this to lots of people. When I say we, the Americans, I didn't. And we were wrong so many times, right? Now, normally the problem was we'd take them to Guantanamo. Having abused them in Bagram, we took them to Guantanamo until those of us who were lawyers got in there and started developing the real facts. You know, no one would have known that Binyam Mohammed's story wasn't true until he talked to me. And so when you got lawyers, you could disprove it. But with a lot of people, I know of several people who were taken to the same prison in Morocco that Binyam was taken to with the razor blades, right? British people who ended up back in Britain. There were certain people who could have done two things. You know, some of them decided they wanted to be snitches after they'd been tortured a lot. And, you know, I don't like that, but you can understand it. Yeah. And some of them, they just decided this is the wrong guy. Mustafa Setmarian Nasser is a great example. Do you know his case?
No.
So he was meant in the original days to be the great propagandist for Al-Qaeda. But then they captured him, they abused him. He actually hated bin Laden. And when they started looking into it, they discovered, oh, God, you know, this guy really wasn't. He hated him. So they didn't send him to Guantanamo Bay. They sent him to Syria to disappear him. Now, the biggest one was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, right? And I'm sure you know that story. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was the guy who was in Bagram. He was prisoner 001 in Bagram. And Shaka told me about him. Shaka Rama, I love Shaka. He was my British Saudi guy. And Shaka so annoyed the Guantanamo guards. It gave me such joy. Anyway, Shaka was number 5005 in Bagram, and he described very early days to me about Ibn Sheikh al-Libi being there. He was thought to be a big Al-Qaeda person. Actually, he wasn't. And his case is now famous in certain circles, but not publicly famous enough. The FBI was interrogating him. He was cooperating. He didn't like bin Laden. He had had a weapons camp in Afghanistan solely focused on Libya. He hated Gaddafi. And so his sole goal of his jihad was Gaddafi. And in fact, he got closed down by Al-Qaeda and he was pissed off at them for doing that. So when he was detained originally, he sang like a canary to the FBI, and the FBI were very pleased with themselves. At that point in the NSC, the National Security Council, there was an argument between the CIA and the FBI about who could get intelligence quickest. And that's the moment that the CIA said the FBI was being too soft and they needed to get heavy. And, you know, the famous thing where Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney went with the CIA, and that's where the worst stuff began that the Americans did. They authorized the CIA to take over from the FBI. The CIA come into Bagram. They go in, and this is now documented. It's in the Senate report, some of it. They say to al-Libi, we're going to, pardon my French, you might have to beep this out. They say, we're going to go find your mother and fuck her. And that's a quote, right? And they put him in a casket, in a coffin, right? And carry him out of Bagram in a coffin. Now, I knew that originally from Shaka because he told me, he saw it all. But then they took him to Egypt, where they took cattle prods to him and tortured him and got him to say that Saddam Hussein was working on WMD with Al-Qaeda. There were three reasons why America thought it was a good idea to invade Iraq. That was one of the legs of your three-legged stool. Now, he said it under torture. He immediately recanted it. But Colin Powell said it in the UN as a reason to go to war. George Bush repeated it. That was one of the reasons we went to war in Iraq. Now, is it or is it not true that there were WMD in Iraq? No, we now know it's not true. We know it's total nonsense. So if there's any evidence that torture gets false evidence, that's it. But the difference between that and arguably Binyam Mohammed and me torturing you, and I say, Shehzad, are you a terrorist? Are you?
I mean, depends.
No, I'm now going to slap you hard. Are you a terrorist?
Yes.
Yeah. So now I'm going to prosecute you, and bad luck you, too bad. So when I torture you into a statement that gets you in trouble, that's one thing. When I torture you into saying there are WMD in Iraq and then there's a war and 100,000 people get killed, that's a very different thing. And so Ibn Sheikh al-Libi is one of the massive, massive disasters of the post 9/11 torture program. And this is where you get into the really bad stuff. And I know I went on a rant on that.
No,
but I
mean, as far
why.
as WMDs are concerned, I think there's enough evidence to now know that it was disingenuous. It was not incompetence. They pretty much knew the WMDs did not exist, but they just wanted to do.
No, I think that's true in Iraq, but I don't think it's true actually when they're torturing people in Pakistan and then Afghanistan. I think they're so paranoid about it.
Maybe the officers, but I think the people at the top wanted to go to Iraq. It's putting the horse before the cart. They wanted to go, and then they started looking.
No, you're
for
100% right on Iraq. I think on al-Libi, they just wanted to go there and they just made stuff up.
So let me set up the Ghazni story, and if I get anything wrong,
I'm sorry. The reason I was saying that is, I'm now remembering why I went on a massive tangent. Sorry, is there's a whole slew of examples of the Americans figuring out either they got it wrong, or it was just really embarrassing. And so the reason they sent Ibn Sheikh al-Libi to Libya, not to Guantanamo, is they never wanted that story to come out. I had a line on it, right? I had a way into al-Libi when he was alive in Libya, because I knew that story and I wanted to prove it. And then they killed him. And that was the American MO. They never wanted to dirty their own hands. They always got someone else to do it. And in Aafia's case, the ISI. That's where it goes.
Let me set it up. If I get anything wrong, please do correct me. They let Aafia go. They tell her that they give her son. They put them in a bus. They say that your daughter, Maryam, will be handed over to you at Khalid bin Walid.
There's one little fact there, which is important, is Ahmed never said to Aafia that he was her son. And this was 5 years on. And he was so terrified. I mean, he was still saying later, as we'll get to in a minute, that he was Ihsan Ali. He was still saying that a couple of months later. So he didn't say it. Aafia was wearing a full chador, so you couldn't actually see her. And she really, really wasn't sure if it was him. She's told me that. She wasn't sure. She's kind of not sure to this day if it was him. So they're on the bus together. She's told that's her son. She's not sure, but she's told she can go get her daughter. Yeah.
So they go to Khalid bin Walid mosque over there, and there she's tired, so she's waiting. I think Aafia Siddiqui said that she heard the azan and she went there, but that's not what you said.
Well, I don't know. I think that's all a bit of a fantasy. The truth is, just explain to me what that means exactly again, because I'm going to make
the azan?
Yeah.
The azan's the call to prayer.
Call to prayer.
Yes.
I'm sure she was there for 2 prayers, so I'm sure it happened, right? But where did Fawzia get that from?
So then the story that you've told is that the tailor across Mohammad Amjad Mohammadi, he sees her, he says, this war is happening, why is there a woman? My mother's house.
Couple of facts.
Go for it.
The first thing is, on that bus there's a Pakistani, right? And that's the Pakistani agent, which we'll get to in a minute. The second is, when I went there for the first time, I suppose, to Ghazni was November last year. And they told me no one would talk to me. And I said, I bet they will. And I was only there for 3 hours, and I got 6 people who signed statements about, and then stayed a very cold night in a very cold hotel in Ghazni. And so there's a whole slew of people who saw her. She was there for 7 hours. And that's actually a very important point, because the American position is that she was going to Ghazni for 3 plots. And one was to apparently be a suicide bomber at a mosque. The second was to kill the governor of Ghazni. And the third was to poison the water supply of Ghazni, right?
Is the governor house close to the mosque? Because
no, it's quite a long way away. And, I've talked to the governor, and I've got an affidavit from the governor, Usman Usmani, who tells me a whole different story. But, the thing is, the Americans say that. So again, you just got this common sense thing. If that's really what she's doing, why does she sit outside the Khalid bin Walid mosque for 7 hours where all these people see her? And she was sitting in a place, it was an all-male mosque, right? And lots of people saw her there, and she was sitting under a tree. And various people commented she went to pray not in the mosque, but outside. They didn't want to disturb her. And, there are all these sort of sweet people who remembered this because it was a big incident. And so I got all these statements from these people about her sitting there for 6 or 7 hours. Now, if you're going to have poison and put it in the water, you're going to go do that. If you're going to blow up a suicide bomber vest outside a mosque, you're going to have a suicide vest, and she didn't. If you're going to kill the governor of Ghazni, you're going to have a weapon to do it. She didn't. So again, the legal term is that is total bullshit. And you need to think that, because then you've got to think, if that's not true, what is true?
So on the flip side, if the ISI plan is that we're going to set it up and get the Afghan guards, give them a tip off that this is going to happen, and they shoot her and our hands are washed of it, why did they wait 7 hours?
No, we see they didn't. This is the beauty. I've got to say, can I just say, I think the ISI are not very good at their job half the time.
You don't say.
I mean, when they were trying to throw acid in my friend
Did you follow our last elections?
I don't know.
If I get picked up after this, Clive, take up my case, please.
I'll have to. But you may have to take my case up, because I'm going to say something.
We'll get this podcast out after you've left the country.
Well, I'm going to come back in, and if they want to arrest me, they're welcome, because I have free speech. And when they were trying to throw acid in the face of my friend Shehzad Akbar, he's been my friend for years. We did human rights cases for many, many years. I was at his house the night before that he did this, because he was being kind to my son. It took him 6 months to work out what his address was. I could tell you what your address is in 30 seconds, because I got a system where I can track you people down, so be polite to me. I don't know where these people get off, and they shouldn't be going around throwing acid in people's faces in the first place. But the bottom line is, if they're going to do these things, they need to come to my training, learn how to track people down, because they do seem to be genuinely hopeless. And what happened, I haven't got the total facts, but I got a lot of them. So I have tracked down the Afghan police officer who took the list of things that Aafia had with her when she was arrested.
She's only mentioned the women's clothing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've talked to the governor of Ghazni at the time, Usmani, Dr, a nice guy, about this stuff, about him bringing the evidence and tipping it out on the table of his mansion and showing it to the American captain. He says this is utter nonsense. I didn't know that captain. No one would take evidence and tip it out on their dining room table. This is nonsense. Now, the American position is that she has a bag with a map of how to get to the waterworks with some poison to put in it. Interesting. I had my students, they love this stuff. It's great to research. As to whether that amount of cyanide would do anything in the waterworks to kill everyone in Ghazni. Interestingly, don't drink the water in Ghazni, because it's got a lot of arsenic in it. The levels are amazing. But no, of course it wouldn't. But more importantly, she never went near the waterworks. And then there's all this stuff about, New York, about biological weapons in a particular place. I forget the name. Do you remember the name of the
42nd Street?
No,
right?
no,
the maps of New York and the 42nd
but
Street.
the real thing is
there were gels and substances.
But she was going to get biological weapons from a place, I'm blanking on the name, but it was a biological weapons thing that the Americans had that was closed down in 1962. And they've actually invited the Russians to come and look around to show it's not there now. This is the place that she was meant to do. And
your take is that there was an ISI official with a bag next to her who had all these documents and then planted them.
They were planning to plant them on her after she got shot as a suicide bomber. Because if you had heard from Afghanistan, Aafia Siddiqui was, going to blow herself up and this child outside a mosque, that would have been a compelling story, the whole story about her being evil. But there's a bigger point. My little ISI witness who's, has told me why they do that stuff. And I'm not going to tell you that story now because I'm not meant to, but oh boy, these people are bad. They really shouldn't do that. Anyway.
But the argument is that they wanted to do this because Fawzia Siddiqui was making a lot of noise in Pakistan and they just wanted to get rid of...
Look, Musharraf was still clinging to power in July 2008. If she had come back to Pakistan then and explained what had happened to her and explained what had happened to her kids and only had Ahmed say, or didn't have any of them, this would have been massive, right?
But why was the CIA letting her go then?
No, because they were doing the same thing as they did with Ibn Sheikh al-Libi and Mustafa Setmari and Nasser. They were getting someone else to do their dirty work. The CIA would not do a plan like an assassination here. But what they tell me in Afghanistan, and I haven't bottomed this out yet, so don't hold me to this, they say that the suicide bomber call was 2 days before July the 17th, when she was outside the mosque. Now, that would make no sense, right? That this woman is going to come and be a suicide bomber in 2 days, and then Aafia is sitting outside the mosque with a kid with fruit in this jacket.
Did they take off the jacket? Because the police video of the interrogation, the kid is not wearing the jacket.
No, much later. Right? Yeah,
okay.
That was the next day. So clearly they'd taken all that off by then. But, I think... this is speculation, but I think the plan was that the Afghan National Police would be a bit more competent and they would show up much quicker than they did. But the statement I got this time, which was actually very compelling from one of the witnesses in Ghazni, was that he heard them as the ANF showed up. They said, "We've been told that there's a Pakistani woman who's going to be a suicide bomber," right? Now, she's in a chador and you can't see she's Pakistani. So that sort of corroborates, not absolute evidence, but it corroborates that there's a call that's been made by someone. According to the Afghans, this was before, they think, the guy I talked to who did the records in Ghazni said that they had records of it all. They had records of him taking an inventory of what was in her bag. But those were all destroyed when the Americans were about to leave in Ghazni. But he says there was always a copy sent to Kabul. So I've got my good friends in the Interior Ministry in Kabul trying to find this, along with various other evidence. We'll definitely get the evidence about Ahmed being in prison, because I've had it from an official non-Taliban source, the prison he was in, which is a place called Bagram Base in Afghanistan, Kabul. So we'll definitely track that down and, whatever, we'll see what the ultimate.
So the Afghan guards, unaware of this plot of ISI, come to shoot her.
Yeah.
The tailor, Amjad Mohammadi, jumps in front.
Yeah.
They take her in. The interrogation video where they're speaking their language and she's saying in Urdu that hum kasoorwar nahi ho. But she's also directing the child. It doesn't, at least, again, speculative, but it doesn't feel like they've met for the first time in 5 years, because she seems to be telling the kid what to do. He's hiding the face. She's hiding the face. She seems to be well within her senses in that moment.
Well, look, I've got a statement from the chief of police says that she's not. And I've got a statement from the governor of Ghazni who says she was totally out of her mind. Now, you can speculate from just looking at someone on a video. You can also use common sense, right? I mean, if it's true that she and her kids were abducted in Karachi, I think we can all believe that, that's true. That's a fact. If it's true that she was then taken and tortured in Afghanistan for 5 years, terrified of where her children were, being shown children on the other side of glass that apparently being tortured, and she thinks are her children. At that point, if you think when she gets to Ghazni that she's calm and collected and controlling the system, then I think that's a fantasy land. Now, look, I've heard what the people there say about her, and they all say that she was incredibly distraught. That makes sense to me. I've heard what she tells me about it, which is very confused, and that makes sense to me.
But,
so,
if that's the argument, that she's highly traumatized, she's not in her senses.
I think, even
she's obviously highly traumatized.
Yeah, even me as a British person, I think I'd be pretty messed up. So then
even the American story, which seems ridiculous on the face of it, that she managed to put her foot across the curtain. For people who don't know, the American soldiers
Let's
came.
Tell the story.
Can I say
the?
Go for it.
So this is the prosecution theory, and I want to give it the best chance possible. According to them, they come into this room in the Afghan National Police headquarters. They've come with some Afghans, and there's a bunch of Americans, FBI, and special services. And according to them, there's a curtain in the room. One of them says the chief warrant officer went and looked behind the curtain and then sat down. Well, that didn't happen because she was behind the curtain. What they say then is that he put his gun down on the ground. There's not a single American soldier that you'd talk to who would ever do that. Then later they try to give this chief warrant officer a medal, and a bunch of them object, saying they clearly shouldn't. According to the Americans, she reaches under the curtain, picks up an M4 rifle, and starts shooting, shouting Allahu Akbar, as we want to say all Muslims do. And she lets off some rounds, and then in self-defense, the guy who had allegedly put his gun down pulls out his 9mm pistol and shoots her. And there's a big struggle on the floor where she fights back. That's their story, right? And to support it, they show 2 holes up in the wall that are apparently bullet holes. That's their case. Now, when you got anything like this, the first thing you do is look at the physical evidence, right? And so there are various things that are not conclusive, but they're strong. There are shell casings from a 9mm pistol, but there are no shell casings from an M4 rifle. There's no gunshot residue on her, none on the curtain. There's no fingerprints from her on the gun. And
all this forensic was done.
Yeah.
All right.
And so then the key thing, though, is where they say these 2 bullet holes.
Which were already there in the press conference
in
the morning.
Press conference. So
do I get up to 99 by knowing that?
You do. I think 98.5%. So the key thing is that they say these are 2 bullet holes. Everyone who says that she fired a gun, not, very inconsistent stories from the Americans, but, 2 or 3 of them say she fired a couple of bullets, and they say those are the bullet holes. They dug them out to try to find the bullets. They didn't find any bullets. Then they discover the video from the morning where the 2 holes are, and before it all happened. So I think it's pretty safe to say that there is 0 evidence to support the theory that she ever tried to fire a gun. And there's one extra question. This is your quiz to get up to 99. Where is the safety catch on an M4 rifle?
I know on the previous podcast you also asked the same question.
Did you learn from this?
It's on the right side. Is it not?
No, it's not. Of course not. But whereabouts on the left side? You see, you would make a terrible terrorist. You really are. He's hopeless, isn't he?
I know. I want them to think I'm like a terrible terrorist, which is why I'm feigning ignorance on purpose.
The truth is, I didn't know, right? I wouldn't have the slightest idea. And I asked all these guys in Afghanistan who use AK-47s, where is it on an M4 rifle? None of them knew. It's nonsense, right? That didn't happen. Now, what her story was that she was in the room behind the curtain. She hears American voices. She thinks, oh my goodness, I'm going to be taken back for more torture. She's trying to escape, and she wants to escape, and she peeks around the curtain, and then they see her, and this chief warrant officer says she's on the loose and shoots her. Now, that's totally consistent with everything. And what's also consistent is, what I've learned from a number of other cases there in Afghanistan at the time. There'd been a number of prosecutions of American soldiers for shooting people without just cause. Now, I'm always trying to defend everyone. And to be honest, if I was in that situation and it was very hostile in there, the Afghans had not let the Americans in. They'd refused to let them in several times. In the end, the Americans bribed the, chief to get in. It's hostile. The Americans are on edge, clearly. And you can understand how someone would make a mistake. Just if they did drop Suleiman on his head, you can understand that could have been an accident. They certainly weren't trying to kill the little child. That would have been an accident. Here, I think it's understandable in a war zone that the guy would freak out. What's not so good is that then they get together and confect this story that gets this woman 86 years in prison. And, we've tried to approach these guys. I set a very nice conservative investigator on them to try to get them to talk. They've all talked to each other, and no one's ever going to talk about this again. Now, if we end up having to go to a New York court, I'll subpoena them. And we'll see what happens. But I doubt they will.
Already in American custody. They stage this, or they get the ISI to stage this. Then she's with the Afghans. They refuse to hand her over. They've said the government will not allow them to hand over Dr. Aafia to the Americans. And the idea is they stage this just so to pretend that now she's hurt and we need to rush her and take her away.
I think they shoot her in panic. But then when they've shot her, they discover she's an unarmed woman. They think, oh my goodness, I'm going to be court-martialed for this. That's when they make up the story. And their stories are very
They knew that was Dr. Aafia.
Oh, yeah, they knew that all along.
And they wanted her in custody.
Look, this is what I think is true. And I can't prove this yet, but I think this is true. See, I think in New York at the trial, they weren't all lying. Normally, people aren't just lying. Normally, they're either incredibly stupid or just wrong, in my experience. Sometimes they're corrupt, but not often. I think what's really going on here, given everything I now know and everything I know about the CIA, because I've spent 20 years dealing with these people, is I don't think the CIA told anyone about her being in their custody. They kept that secret. They fought tooth and nail to prevent the United States Senate from having the report that came out in 2012, 2014. And, they don't want this out because what they did in the wake of 9/11 was fundamentally criminal, going around torturing people. And they're deeply mortified by it, and they just don't ever want that to come out. And they have a whole method of secrecy. So I'm confident that the FBI didn't know that Aafia was in CIA custody. I think the FBI genuinely thought she was still on the 10 most wanted list, right? And there are reason to suspect that from a release by the Attorney General of New York, of America, in 2004 that lists her as one of the deadly 7. Now, if you look at the list of deadly 7 who are out there that the Attorney General says are still out there and they're threatening America, I've got a whole thing of that in the clemency petition. They're wrong on all of them. I mean, one of them was dead already. One of them's never been heard of ever. One of them, there was a lawsuit about how someone said that he was on the deadly 7 in Canada and he got sued for defamation. So this was all nonsense. But with Aafia, I think that the CIA hadn't told anyone that she was in their custody. So the FBI hears that the Afghans have got this Aafia Siddiqui woman, which proves she told her real name, contrary to what they said at trial, but what the Afghans said. And I think the FBI came zooming in thinking, we're going to make a big arrest at this point. And they didn't know that she'd actually been with them all the time. That's what I think the truth is. I can't prove all of that yet, but we'll get there eventually.
So before we get to the trial, what do you think of this idea that, they got Al Capone on tax fraud, right? So they knew, or at least they assumed.
See, that's going to get you up to 99. Because Al Capone on tax, that's a very important issue. That's how they always get people. So
they staged this, and let me get to 99.5. You mentioned that
he's really hopeful, isn't he?
SDNY has a 99% conviction rate. One out of 200 people.
99.5. Yeah. You're aiming
1 out of 200 people. So we know, I'm not going to vouch for the American justice system, but is the idea that they think they know who Aafia Siddiqui is and what else she's done. So they're trying to get her on this attempted murder charge.
Well, the real thing is they've got to have an alternative to the fact they shot an unarmed woman, right? So they come up with this story. Now, how many people do you know who supposedly did something in Afghanistan, were taken on a plane all the way to America and put on a civil trial, right? Doesn't happen. So this is unique. And one of the things that sort of pisses me off about all this is, let's pretend for a minute Aafia really did everything they said. It's not true, but let's pretend it is true. Let's pretend she really tried to shoot 2 Americans in Afghanistan, and let's pretend that's why they shot her. You're talking about a country where 100,000 people got killed, really killed. No one ever got prosecuted for hardly any of them. There's like 2 times that Americans were prosecuted for shooting a swathe of innocent civilians. And here we have the only person who's been prosecuted civilly for anything in Afghanistan is a woman who was the only person who got shot. And she gets 86 years for that. This is lunacy. So, I'm willing to swallow everything they say. But, there are different defenses in what I've put forward in the clemency petition. Because also, I'm prepared to eat the entire prosecution case on the fact that she was a kidnap victim. We can say, yeah, all right, maybe you want to say she did try to shoot these people. If you're a kidnap victim under the law, you're allowed to shoot the people who kidnapped you. So there are so many ways in which it actually doesn't matter what the prosecution says.
That's the argument, right? Like if we start discussing the merits of the Al Capone tax case, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
They wanted Al Capone,
Yeah.
and
they were going to get him on something.
Yes. So she might not have done this, but in their minds, they thought that she was involved in financing, so they had to get her one way or another, right?
And for attempted murder in America, you'd be unlikely to get 10 years in prison, right? For that alone.
I mean, if you're in Texas and you might just get exonerated for attempted.
That's all.
They'll be like, sure, stand your ground.
It's your constitutional right to shoot
your
people,
ground,
obviously. Yes. And the Texans wouldn't leave it at attempt. They would make sure you're dead.
Chase you down and shoot you.
Can I tell you a little story about that?
Go for it.
So the first time I went to Afghanistan on Aafia's case, the guy who runs their GID, their Secret Service, very nice chap who was in Guantanamo, was really worried that I, as one of his friendly lawyers, was going to get done in Afghanistan. So he gives me these 3 Taliban guys with the big tall guys with their black stuff and their black turbans and their AK-47s who had to be my guards for the time we went to Ghazni. And they were very nice guys. And they got quite upset when I went walkabout in Ghazni because they were meant to be looking after me. And so they come rushing up. And I apologize. I don't want to get them in trouble. But I said, look, this is the safest place in the world now. It's not like when I came here, when the Americans were here. Afghanistan is utterly safe. I don't need you here. It's nice to have you. But I'm going to Texas next week, and if you'd come with me there. They laughed, and I just love to walk around Texas with 3 Taliban, Yeah. Anyway, to go back.
I think once you do that, if the Taliban start carrying guns in Texas, open carry laws will end the next morning. The next morning they'll end.
We will also be surrounded by mad Texans who'll shoot all of us.
Probably.
So anyway, where were we? Going back to
the court.
To the court.
Yes.
But on that, which part?
So the fact that this entire case is a sham is deliberately set up to get her on something or the other. But this is
what I was going to say. With a lot of these things, if she's a terrorist, put her on trial for terrorism, right? And, put your money where your mouth is. But they're not going to do that. So in this, they charge her with attempted murder, which is not a massive offense. The prison she's in has got people who murdered all sorts of people in it. It has the women's death row in it. But then they can use all of that in sentencing. And one of the extraordinary things about American sentencing laws is they can actually use evidence in sentencing where you were acquitted of something. So the jury found that she had not premeditated anything. That was the jury's finding. The judge says, well, I'm going to say she did. And so they enhance it from what might be 10 years, in which case she had long since been set free, up to 86 years mainly on the terrorism enhancement, which is all their fantasy about exactly what you were saying, which is they think she's a bad person. They've said all this stuff, all of which turns out to be false, about her being a terrorist. They said the Blood Diamond stuff. They said the stuff in Boston. They said all these other things. And they said she was wandering around Afghanistan looking for her husband, Ammar Al Balochi, all of which we can prove is nonsense. And that's why she ends up with 86 years. And they do that because they think she's a bad person. She's in FMC Carswell with a thing on her record saying she's a terrorist linked to Osama bin Laden.
Is there any credence to the fact that somebody, presumably from the American state, got up during the proceedings and threatened 2 jurors who were presumably going to vote in favor of Aafia?
No. Well, I mean, there might have been, but there was definitely, I don't think, again, that was a big American conspiracy, that one. I think it was actually a nutty guy who genuinely was upset about Aafia being there, just like that crazy guy in Texas who attacked the mosque, right? These are things that Aafia massively disagrees with, and yet they're held against
the synagogue, right?
The synagogue, yeah.
Held and 3 people hostage at the synagogue, demanding them to release Aafia Siddiqui.
Exactly. And if we as Americans had common sense instead of just the desperate desire to maintain the fact that the emperor is wearing clothes, we'd say, we really ought to get rid of this woman so these other nutty people don't do bad things. But we won't do that. Instead, we blame her for the synagogue attack when she's fundamentally opposed to it and said so immediately. So, that's the problem. I think this guy who came into court was genuinely an Aafia supporter, was an idiot, and contributed massively to her being convicted.
Do you have any take on the meeting of Hussain Haqqani and the judge?
I've heard about it. I honestly don't know. People say that he told the judge that, she needed to go to prison or whatever.
But then Pakistan had spent $2 million on the lawyers.
They're forced to do that. I'm not going to go into detail about the lawyers.
But you don't have a great opinion of them.
I think what they did at trial was profoundly ill-directed. This was not a criminal case. This was a political case. And it was tough for them because back in 2009, you couldn't wander around Afghanistan like I could now. And actually, they couldn't do it today like I can. I'm lucky that I can do it because of my history. So it would have been hard for them. But no, if I'd been doing that case, it would have gone a very different way.
But it is true that Aafia Siddiqui went on a rant about all of this being a Jewish conspiracy and the judge being a Jew.
Look,
and the Jews being behind all of this.
Look, I'm half Jewish, right?
So she was blaming you.
You want me to hate everyone? I've talked to Aafia about stuff a lot. Now, she is amazingly traumatized by everything she's gone through. And my father was bipolar, right? He was deeply what we call mentally ill. I've written a book about him. I don't like the term mentally ill. I am my father's son, and you can judge me as you wish.
I suffer from a lot of mental health issues myself, so no judgment here.
No, and it's not, I don't think I think those are idiosyncrasies of people. And I hate it when we stigmatize people for their idiosyncrasies. I hate it that they did it to my dad, and I don't want to do it to Aafia. I think it's fundamental abuse of human dignity. So I'm not going to say Aafia, I'm not going to label her as a paranoid schizophrenic or some stuff like that. But one thing she would agree with, and I think is manifestly the truth, is she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder like no one else I've ever seen. And she's then put in a prison where she says she's been raped twice.
At the Federal Medical Center in Carswell.
Yeah. And she says she's subject to sexual abuse all the time. She is. I can tell you that as a fact. That she's, in order to go to the doctor, she's forced to go through a strip search, which, Westerners, we walk around on the beach naked half the time. It's one thing for someone on, Black's Beach in San Diego to do that. It's not going to happen with an observant Muslim woman. And she's really traumatized by that. She doesn't get medical care, but she's not willing to be humiliated by that. Many, many other things going on in Carswell. I've got 1,500 pages of their records. She's actually got an amazingly positive prison record that in 16 years, she's got 13 disciplinaries. You compare that to 150 murders in prison in America per year, and you see that it's not bad. But of her 13 disciplinaries, 7 are for alleging that guards have sexually abused or raped her. That's a criminal offense. You're not allowed to lock someone up who's a whistleblower, right? And this prison, I've been to almost every death row in America. I've been to Guantanamo 42 times. FMC Carswell is the worst prison I've ever been to. And there's a reason for that. And I think the reason is that one day when they were really pissing me off by making me wait for an hour and a half to go see her, I took a look at their visitation log while they weren't watching because I was just curious.
Let me get to 99.9%. Every single one of the people held there, on average, get 1 visitation per 80 years.
83 years. Very close.
Pretty close. There were 4 visitations from your last visit to your next visit.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been to see Aafia 12 times in the last year. That means I've seen her as often as the rest of the million American lawyers have seen any client in FMC Carswell. And, what that says to me, that's true because people don't have a right to lawyers unless they pay for them. And so it's only lunatics like me, do-gooders, I believe we're called, which I don't mind that. Because
the real life Justice League.
But the alternative is do
In real life, Batman looks like Alfred.
Well, anyway, At any rate, and I want to be Thor Ragnarok, who's, because I like Thor. So, the problem is this, that a prison that doesn't have oversight, people have great power and they abuse that power. And the reason that 13 guards have been prosecuted for rape and convicted is because it's happening there. And we got to stop that. And the only way it gets stopped, I've been so mistreated by this prison that they've so annoyed me that I'm going to make their lives miserable.
You're going to shut it down.
I'm going to shut that prison down if it's the last thing I do. And, and that's fun. And, but I'm going to do it whether we get Aafia out or not, because that place needs to close down for the other 976 women there.
I mean, you've gone through the hundreds of pages of medical reports and they've tried to hide the torture. And I know you don't like talking about Aafia's mental or physical health, so I'm not...
Oh, no, I'll talk about some of her physical health because there are very obvious things. When you see her, she's lost all her teeth on one and most of the others. She hasn't got any dental care. Now, they're going to say, well, we let her, but she won't go. She went once. She went through a strip search. She was taken there. They gave her all the, x-rays, and then they did nothing for 2 years. So the next time they come along and say they want to do it again, she says, no, I'm not going to be strip searched by you people, so you won't do anything. She's deaf in one ear, bad hearing in the other. That's from the beatings she got in Bagram and elsewhere. And they've done nothing about that. Her eyesight's bad. She's got palsy in the face. She's got numbness in the feet that slightly freaked me out because a doctor tells me that's diabetes and I've got numbness in the feet and I didn't
My foot is numb right now.
I know. I thought, I don't, it doesn't hurt. I'm not going to do anything about it. But I think I'm going to go see a doctor now. But anyway, there's all these physical things that she desperately needs treatment on. She desperately needs therapy for all the night. What she really needs is to see her kids, and she needs to know what happened to Suleiman. And so, whether we achieve what I want to do in the next few months or not, I'm going to follow that stuff up.
The point of bringing this up was that in KSM's case, Khalid Sheikh Mohammad's case, we know a terrible, reprehensible person, mastermind on 9/11, the worst thing that has ever happened in the world, according to American history. The fact that he was tortured is a mitigating circumstance in sentencing.
Right.
So why is the same logic not used for Aafia when it's being used for one of the worst people in the world?
And he will get a sentence less than death for the very worst crime, as you say, that's ever happened in America. It's going to make my life as a death penalty defense lawyer a lot easier that I can say the guy who killed 2,997 people didn't get death. And it's going to be that. And he will end up, if Aafia had to stay in prison for the rest of her life, which she'd have to under the current sentence, and KSM had to stay for the rest of his life, she would spend more time in prison than Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for even alleged attempted murder of two people when she's the one who gets shot and he's the one who allegedly is behind almost 3,000 murders. It's just another issue of madness. And I do think it's taken us a long time in Guantanamo to get them to see that they need to use torture as mitigation. Certainly is a big part of what I've put in the clemency petition, that you got to show this woman clemency no matter what you believe, because she's been through worse than Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
So the options right now are clemency, presidential pardon. Biden is on his way out. I don't think you have much hope in Trump if he comes into power.
We do.
Didn't he just pardon one person his last
the thing about Trump
term
is he only let one person out of Gitmo. But he pardoned all sort of people. And
Kyle Rittenhouse type of people.
And the first person he'll pardon in his new term
are all the January 6th shaman.
No. The first person he'll pardon is himself.
Probably.
Obviously. And that's going to be a first, a president.
I mean, that Clarence Thomas has already given him that on a plate.
So, look, let's one thing I would appreciate, I hope you're going to put this out soon because I really need some help on this. So my current strategy is this, that November 5th election, January the 20th is the inauguration. So you've got 10 weeks. That's when we get things done in America. You got Joe Biden, who's lost 2 children himself in his lifetime. And he's a Catholic. He's really actually quite a nice guy. And he's got a bad reputation in the world of Islam at the moment, particularly over Gaza, but also over other things. He wants to do something about that, and he really wants to draw a line under 9/11 and the madness after that. He was there looking up at that TV screen when they were assassinating Osama bin Laden. You know, this has been a big part of his time as vice president and president. So if we can get to him enough, I think we have a pretty reasonable shot of getting clemency. The thing I learned this morning in Islamabad is the sense is that there's going to have to be a deal. And as you know from our other president, you know, The Art of the Deal was written by President Trump, and it's Shakil Afridi. Now, why the Pakistan government or the military won't do that is kind of beyond me. What they're saying is, you know, why would we give up one of our citizens? No one gives up their citizens. That's nonsense. When we have spies, we give them up all the time, you know.
After selling our citizens for many years.
You do it all the time. So
at this point, you probably can get our citizens on eBay.
I mean, looking around this room, I'm not sure I'm going to buy
I have sold Farooq for a cup of coffee, so you know what we're worth at this point.
I know the price on eBay, but I'm just worried about what I'm going to have to do to give them coffee for the next 20 years. Anyway, you know, we got to work this out, and we got to do this in that 10-week window, and we need to be doing it now. The most important thing is to get the attention of the White House, and I'm doing what I can, but you know, the Pakistan government will send a letter. That'll help a bit, but not a lot. What I asked them to do and what the judges ordered them to do in Islamabad High Court is to send an embassy there. Because if we send some highfalutin Pakistani people, you know, a senator, a doctor, a military person, you know, that sort of thing, who say, we're coming to the White House for Aafia Siddiqui, they're going to pay attention. And then hopefully we need to flood the White House with messages. I would like you, if you don't mind, I'll give it to you, the website of the White House and the portal where you can send your messages. Please don't be too offensive. Please just write nice stuff to Joe Biden.
You're speaking to Pakistanis.
Yeah. Are you nice people? I don't know.
You've not read our comments online.
Well, please.
I mean, people abuse when somebody announces their birthday.
All right, all right. Well,
you can only imagine what they'll say to the White House.
Can I just ask you to try to behave just this once?
Why do you think the Pakistan government does not have a portal? क्या करेंगे हम अगर पाकिस्तान गवर्नमेंट का portal हुआ?
Yeah.
They'll probably open up another portal.
Well, I've got to say, Joe Biden has one. And I've also...
on the positive side, people can write letters to Aafia and they can send them to you, right?
They can send them... No,
Clive Stafford
before
Smith,
that...
2020 at Gmail?
You can do that, but before that, let me just get... I do want people to send them to the president, being polite, and try, please, to talk about his empathy because of his own children, talk about his Catholic faith, talk about repairing relations with Islam, and just do the right thing, right? And don't rape women in prison. So, you know, write these things, and I want thousands of them to go, right? And I want some of them in Urdu, because that pisses them off. They got to translate them, and I like that. And so if you want to do it in Pashto, Urdu, Greek, whatever you like, I don't care. Send them. And, you know, if you're willing, copy me in. As you just gave it, my email is clivestaffordsmith2020@gmail.com. Now, on to what you were about to say, which is, I think, the single best thing I've achieved so far for Aafia is it occurred to me that what this poor woman needed was support. And so we've set up a thing which is actually called lettersforaafia@gmail.com. Letters number 4 Aafia@gmail.com. If you send letters to her there, preferably, again, not the abusive stuff that you're talking about, but I hope why she inspires you. She's not so totally into being told she's a victim, but it's really good for her because she's abused. She's in admin seg, the administrative segregation in FMC Caswell. There's only 7 people in there, and they're not mentally balanced people. And they abuse her horribly, just like the guards. And one thing she does is she reads these letters out to them. from nice Pakistani people. And I will say, when you send us these letters, if you really say anything rude, I'm going to censor it, because I do read them, because they go in from me as a legal mail. And I send in, with the help of someone who's helping me, 80 pages every couple of weeks. And Aafia loves that stuff. But I go through them. They've got to be in English, I'm afraid, because otherwise they won't go in. And so I go through, just make sure no one's saying, let's bomb a mosque or something, or not a mosque, a synagogue. So we send them in, and they're really good for it. So if your listeners and viewers would mind doing that, it'd really be great.
So the onus for presidential pardon is on our government. But if you look at the historical record, you mentioned Yvonne Ridley. She said Imran Khan was one of the first people to know within 24 hours, or immediately. Afia's Mamu, who was waiting for her at Islamabad airport, told Imran Khan. And then 24 hours later, either the ISI or the state got involved, and they said, let this go, don't do anything. When Imran Khan was going to meet Donald Trump, reporters were told, no questions about Aafia.
See, I feel bad about that. If I'd been representing Aafia then, I've known Imran for 20 years, 25 years. And I'd known his ex-wife, Jemima, for longer. And, I have a very good relationship with him. I respect Imran. I think what's happening here, let me just be honest, I think what's happening to him is anathema. And I'm glad to see that the US Congress is passing resolutions telling the Pakistani ISI and military not to kill him. So that's good. If I had been representing Aafia back when he was Prime Minister, I'd have just asked him to do it, and he would have done it. Now,
I'm sure people asked him to do it.
No, but I would, because I've known him for years. And we went on those rallies into Waziristan on the drone stuff. And
it's not an Imran Khan specific question. The idea is, Yvonne Ridley also mentioned that she managed to negotiate it with the Taliban, that Afia's release, and then the Taliban reneged on that agreement, because Yvonne Ridley claims that the ISI got to the Taliban and they said, we're going to stop supporting you if you get Aafia back. So in terms of the Pakistani state, and you've also alluded to the fact that...
I'm not sure that's the case, actually.
If that's not true, you've alluded to the fact that a lot of people here have a lot to lose. And they have a lot to gain from... And again, you might not agree with Yvonne Ridley's theory, but that's that they can use Aafia. Anytime they want to crank up anti-Americanism, anytime they want to do a protest, they can plaster Aafia's face all over, get what they want from Islamists in Pakistan, get what they want from America by showing them, oh, look.
You are a devious conspiracy theorist.
It's been proven. Ziaul Haq did that. So that's not nothing new.
No, I don't disagree with you. And this, I'll tell you what.
But the question was, and what you want to say, you can say that as well. Is the Pakistani state even interested in getting Aafia back, or are they deliberately making sure that they don't get Aafia back?
Do you know, it depends what you mean by state. I will say this, that I think there's not a single actual elected politician who is not supportive of us. Shehbaz Sharif has actually been really good on this. And he's met with Fawzia. I was hoping to meet with him today myself, but the government's too busy messing up your constitution. But, and I'd like to do that, because actually he really took interest last time, and I'd written up a 16-page thing for him and a 1.5-page thing for him. And he read the 1.5 pages and then said, please let me see the 16-page thing. And he read it all. And he was very emphatic. And I think that if I'd got to see him in person today, his immediate reaction would have been, send this embassy to Washington and do it now. And so, I'm not going to be critical of most of your elected politicians. They know which side the bread's buttered. They know it's the right thing to do for them as well as for Aafia. And so that's good. Now, there are these people who think that they might lose and maybe have all the strange views you just said. And I don't discount that, because I've heard some of these ISI people telling me about their plans with Aafia, and these guys are nutsy. My job is always this. It's always the same, is to play countries off against each other. It's an amazing game. It's really quite fun. And in Guantanamo, it was always the case, right? You had America on one side, and I would go around the world. The hell with America. We were never going to win the argument with them to begin with in the early days. But if I went to Yemen, which I did, I went to all the different countries, and I say, look, I'm here as an American. I'm really sorry about what we're doing to your people. You people should be pissed off. Now let's get your government to intervene for your people. easy as peasy, you know? You could get them to do it every time, and it was great. Because even if you in Pakistan think you're not a number one state, there are 230 million people. And Aafia is one person, and having 230 million people on your side is great. So we've always got to overcome. In Jordan, for example, I got taken in by their secret police. Fortunately, it was the head of their secret police. And so I had a little word with him, and I was a patronizing British American. And I said, you got to do my bidding. And it was amazing. Actually, they did. I always love that. I think that's very funny. Because the alternative is we expose them. And they either do what their people want or we expose them. And that works. And, you know, I'd rather not expose people. I'd rather they just did the right thing. But my job is to bring power to powerless people. And if the opposition use their power badly, my job is to mess with them. And that's, you know, I don't mind. I enjoy that.
People had sent in a few questions. I don't think there's anything left that we haven't covered, but let's see. How can we help her? Letters and fundraising.
And also sending letters to the White House, sending letters to me for her. Fundraising, yeah, I just spent a lot of money in Afghanistan. You know what? Can I just tell you a little thing, though? I gave away all the money I had left because last time I was in Pakistan, someone stole all my cash. So I thought before I came to Pakistan, I'll give it to the Afghans. And
wow, Pakistan.
And
making us proud.
The Afghans loved that because they really don't like the Pakistanis. When I told them that story, they were so pleased.
It's okay. The Brits have stolen a lot from us.
We stole more.
We can take a few pounds.
Take a bit back.
We can take it back 20 pounds a time. Is Aafia Siddiqui's release possible? Will she be able to come back? Yes.
Yes. And if it doesn't happen this time around, we got plan B, which is to hold an evidentiary hearing in open court in New York. And you'll never get to that because we'll get discovery of all their secrets. They'll capitulate and they'll let it go.
If Pakistanis who are US citizens join together, can the US government be sued for crimes against humanity and gross misconduct? If yes, what steps does he suggest to get this started?
Do you know, there are lots of rules in America that try to prevent you from doing it in the US, although I've got some ways to do it. But the thing I was meeting with the Afghan government about is actually countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan need to learn from us. What the Americans have done in Afghanistan is they've stolen $8 billion from Afghanistan, which they're now giving to the victims of the Afghan war, who they say are American. Now, that's obviously madness because they're actually Afghans. And so I was talking to the Afghans about why don't we just learn from that and do it back? And I'm happy. I want to set up an office in Afghanistan to help them have their own lawsuits against the people who perpetrated these crimes and get their own judgments in the Afghan courts. And then we enforce them through the Hague Convention, which we can do. So there are ways to do it. And I want to do it in Afghanistan because I think they're really open to some imaginative stuff. I'd love to do it in Pakistan if you still have a legal system after next week, which I'm not sure you will.
Was Moazzam Bey compensated for his illegal arrest, captivity, torture, and violations of his human rights? No.
Yeah, he was.
He was.
And, you know, the 16 British people who I represented in Guantanamo, it's one of the few occasions that everyone got compensation, and they got a lot. And it was because of British complicity in this. So they didn't get it for what the Americans did. They got it for what the British did in complicity with the Americans. And they never went to a trial because it would have been fun, but the British didn't want that to come out. So they all got compensated. The amount is secret, but it was quite a lot of money. And I'm very pleased about that.
What are the chances that a swap between Dr. Shakil Afridi and Aafia Siddiqui could happen? Why was the US hell-bent on capturing her? I think we've covered the second part. What are the chances of a swap?
Well, I mean, you know, if you put me in charge of Pakistan, which I'm not sure is going to happen, it happened tomorrow.
We made that mistake
a
century ago. Never
once.
again.
Yeah, not again. And I don't blame you. It ought to happen. It ought to happen. But my challenge to the Pakistan authorities is this. If for whatever reason you're not willing to do that, you got to come up with another deal. I don't care what it is, but actually, you know, I think we should ask the Americans to just show compassion. But the art of the deal is that both sides have to give something, and Pakistan's got to give something, because on your passports, I'm sorry, I'm going to pull out my passport here. I've got several of these things. But what's on the American passport here is exactly what's on your passport, which is that in case of need to give all lawful and aid and protection. That's Pakistan's duty to Aafia. So they got to do everything, right? And they got to come up with some deal to get her justice.
The last question is, did Dr. Aafia suffer from the sad fate because of guilt by association, by getting mixed up with some very wrong people in between her first divorce and suspicious arrest in Afghanistan? After all, her writings and views seem to make her a very committed Islamist activist for much of her life, and she did end up marrying Ammar Al Balochi. We covered that part.
Yeah. No, I think that's all part of the mistakes. And, you know, the war on terror is replete with these mistakes. And I don't think Aafia was ever an extremist in the sense of ever wanting violence. I think she's a very committed Muslim. She very much believes in her faith, but her faith is about peace, actually. It's not about going around blowing people up.
Thank you so much, Clive. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. We're up to 99.5. I think I'm going to give you a special award. You get the Southern District of New York Award.
I got recognized by an OBE.
No, that's sad, isn't it? You probably don't want to put that on your resume.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Clive, and thank you, Farooq, for making it happen. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.